Well, today we are starting a 3-part series on biblical covenants. And why are we doing this exactly? Well, there's actually 2 reasons that we're doing a deep dive into biblical covenants. The first reason is that, as I've mentioned a lot on the show lately, people in the church, I find, tend to talk very vaguely about covenants. And they say things often such as this: God's covenants are unconditional, or God's covenants are unbreakable. These are just a couple of examples of things that I hear pastors and just Christians generally throw out there about covenants. And what I found is that there isn't really a deep level of understanding about what a covenant is or about what the covenants in the Bible entail. So that's the first reason. The second reason that we're talking about this is because also recently on That You May Know Him, we've talked a lot about dispensationalism, which is a theological system which views the Bible through 7 dispensations or 7 periods of time. But as I've mentioned, the problem with this theological system or this interpretive method is that there's nowhere in the Bible where we're actually told that there are these distinct 7 periods of time which affect or determine the way in which God relates to humanity. What we are told about in the Bible is that there are various covenants that God has made with humanity throughout history, and that those have very much to do with the way that God relates to humanity. Because when God makes a covenant with a person or a group of people, he, as we're going to see starting today, always upholds his end of the bargain. My name is Barbera. You're listening to That You May Know Him, illuminating biblical truth and applying it to faith, life, and culture. It's been a month since I last live streamed. I am sorry about that. I'm actually sad that it's been a month since I've been on here live streaming, because I really enjoy doing this. And when I get to come on here and talk about the Bible and teach the Bible and answer questions about the Bible, it's one of my favorite things to do. But for various reasons, it's been a month since I was last live streaming. I am sorry about that. I'm happy to be back. And I want you to know off the top, I'll be back this Friday to resume our live Bible Q&As, which we do twice a month on the first and third Friday of every month. So if you want to submit your questions, you can email us. Our address is info@thatyoumayknowhim.com, or you can just join us on the first and third Fridays of every month at 2 o'clock Eastern on YouTube or Rumble or Facebook, wherever you watch or listen to That You May Know Him, and you can ask your questions there. And I will, if there's time, answer them live. So today, like I said, this is part 1 of 3 episodes I'm going to do on covenants. And today we're going to be looking at the first 2 major covenants in the Bible. And these are generally referred to in scholarship and in the church at large as the Noahic Covenant. That would be the covenant that God made with and through Noah. Noah was sort of the representative of humanity when God made that covenant. And the Abrahamic Covenant, which God made, of course, with Abraham, who in some parts represents the entire nation of Israel, and in some parts of the covenant, he represents all of humanity. But there are other times when God and Abraham are speaking, when God makes promises to Abraham that really only apply to him. And we're going to get into all that today. We're going to deep dive into these 2 covenants today, the Noahic Covenant and the Abrahamic Covenant. Next Wednesday, we'll dive into the Mosaic Covenant and the Davidic Covenant. And then finally, 2 weeks from now, we're going to get into the New Covenant, which is really the one that we're most excited about, because it is the fulfillment of all the others, and it is the final covenant. It's the once for all covenant, the only one that will truly last forever, because in it, God has overcome human weakness. And I'll say more about that as we get to that point. But for now, let's get into the first 2 covenants that you can find in the Bible. And I just want to start actually by reading this definition that I found from the Baker Encyclopedia of the Bible that's about the meaning of covenant in the Bible. And this isn't so much about the meaning of the word covenant as it is about the meaning of the concept of covenant. Now, I typically on this show try to let biblical words define themselves as much as possible based on context, and biblical ideas define themselves. I don't often read from resources like this, but in my experience and my reading of Scripture and understanding of Scripture, I found this particular definition to be extremely accurate, and it really resonated with me. So this is the meaning of the concept of covenant from the Baker Encyclopedia of the Bible. The essence of covenant is to be found in a particular kind of relationship. Mutual obligations characterize that kind of relationship. Thus, a covenant relationship is not merely a mutual acquaintance, but a commitment to responsibility and action. A key word in Scripture to describe that commitment is faithfulness, acted out in a context of abiding friendship. So the main thing I love about this definition of the meaning of covenant from Baker is the last part where, well, first it talks about how mutual obligations characterize the kind of relationship that exists when two parties are in a covenant. But then it goes on to say a key word in Scripture to describe that commitment between the parties is faithfulness, acted out in a context of abiding friendship. The reason that resonates with me so much is because there's a word in Hebrew. When you read the Old Testament in the original language, there's a word that comes up again and again that in many cases is best translated into English as covenant faithfulness. And this word, and this idea, this word which represents the idea is the Hebrew word chesed. Chesed. And there's actually a very well-known place in the New Testament where Jesus quotes from the Old Testament, and he quotes from a verse, Hosea chapter 6, verse 6, which features this word chesed. The original context of that in Hosea is God speaking through the prophet to Israel and saying, look, I no longer want any of your sacrifices. I don't want your sacrifices. I don't want your offerings. He basically says, I don't even want to smell the smell of your sacrifices coming up toward me because they mean nothing to me. And they mean nothing to me because you have completely detached them from your heart. Your purpose in doing them is not to be faithful to me, God says. It's to check a box. It's to fill an obligation. You're not doing these sacrifices from your heart. And so what God says in Hosea 6, and the culmination of this passage is, I desire from you, Israel, my people, chesed. I desire, and I've always desired, covenant faithfulness and not sacrifices. Your sacrifices mean nothing if they're detached from your heart. If you're not acting out of genuine faithfulness toward me, love for me, friendship with me, I don't want your sacrifices. And when Jesus quotes this, he's actually quoting, most scholars believe, from the Greek translation of the Old Testament, because he looks at some Pharisees who are asking him, why do you eat with these sinners and tax collectors? If you're a righteous man, Rabbi, why are you associating with people who aren't righteous? And Jesus tells them, go and learn what this means. And then he quotes that passage. I desire, the way it's translated in most English Bibles today, is mercy and not sacrifice. But the underlying foundation of that passage is, I desire covenant faithfulness and not sacrifice, which is exactly what the Pharisees in that passage were guilty of, the same thing that the people in ancient Israel had been guilty of. They were honoring God with their lips, but their hearts were far from him. Okay, so that's a great working definition, in my opinion, of covenant. It has to do with faithfulness that is marked by friendship, abiding friendship between two parties. Now that I've given you this very simple foundation, let's start by diving into the Noahic Covenant. And I'm going to warn you right now, we're not slacking off this episode. We're going to get into these texts and see what they actually say. So if you really love the Bible, this will be a good, I believe, a good episode for you, because we're going to get into some of the details. And there's going to be a lot of Bible history in this episode. I can't read every passage in its full context because there would just be way too much to read, but I'll read you a lot of the important parts of these passages and then also tell you where to go read to get the full context of these first two biblical covenants. So the Noahic Covenant begins in Genesis chapter 6. And it begins when God looks at the state of the earth and the state of humanity, and he sees that man has become, according to God, only evil continually. And so God finds one righteous man on the earth, and that man's name is Noah. And he is the patriarch of the only family left on earth who, after the flood, will have survived. And when God actually makes a covenant with Noah, it's after the flood has taken place. A lot of people don't realize this. God first appears to Noah before the flood and promises him certain things. But God also gives him a very specific task and a very specific job to do. He tells Noah that he must build an ark that he and his family and two of every animal on earth will be able to survive in when the Lord floods the earth to destroy it. And this is approximately 50 to maybe 75 or 76 years before the actual covenant is made between God and Noah. This is where the story begins in Genesis chapter 6. Starting in verse 5, I'll read through verse 8. Genesis 6, 5 through 8 says this: "The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart." It's one of the saddest verses in the whole Bible, in my opinion. "So the Lord said, I will blot out man who I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord." And so God's covenant with Noah, this is what God first says to Noah. And then he goes on to tell Noah, look, I've determined to make an end to all flesh. The earth is filled with violence through flesh. I will destroy the entire earth. I will destroy every person on the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark. Cover it inside and out. The length of it's going to be 300 cubits and 50 cubits wide and 30 cubits high. Make it different. He describes this ark in detail. Make lower, second, and third decks. I'm bringing waters upon the earth to destroy everything. And then when you get to Genesis 6, verse 18, this is where God says, "But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And of every living thing of all flesh, you shall bring two of every sort into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female." So all this happens. God tells Noah, when Noah's about 500 years old, to build this ark, to bring his family inside of it with the animals. And God says, "I will establish my covenant with you." And this is the first time in Scripture where we see the word covenant actually being used. And just so you know, the word covenant is the Hebrew word berit. And I read you the definition that I think is one of the best ones I've ever heard to tell you what that word means or what the concept entails. But that's what happens. And then all these things that God said were going to happen end up taking place. There's a giant flood. Noah is faithful to God's command. He obeys. He builds an ark. He brings his sons and his sons' wives and his wife into the ark, along with 2 of every animal. And then once that all ends and they survive the flood and they land back on earth, this is where we see the covenant between God and Noah actually come to pass. God actually makes the covenant. And in the next part of the passage that we need to read, which is Genesis 9, 1 through 5, we see the word, Genesis 9, really actually 1 through 11. I'll read both parts. This is where we see the word covenant really come into full fruition. It's used 7 times in this passage, Genesis 9, 1 through 11. So let me start by reading Genesis 9, 1 through 5, and you can see where God actually makes the covenant with Noah, who represents all of humanity at this point, and actually all living creatures. There's several aspects to this covenant, and so I want to just take our time and work through each of them after we read the passage. So Genesis 9, 1 through 5. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. And for your lifeblood, I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require it, and from man. From his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of man." So let's break this down. The first thing that God tells Noah and his sons is this: be fruitful and multiply. That's their end of the bargain. God repeats the command to them that he first gave to Adam and Eve in the garden. God is wanting them to refill the earth with humanity, which was his purpose in creating the earth and man in the beginning. The second part is this: God says, "As I gave you green plants, I give you everything. I now give you everything." So in the original creation, no animals were killed or eaten at all. Remember, death did not exist before sin. And I mean no death of any kind. And every seed-bearing fruit, it says in Genesis, was given to man and woman to sustain them. It wasn't until after Adam and Eve sinned. Does anybody remember the first time in the Bible where we see bloodshed? We actually see bloodshed. Most people jump to Genesis 4 and think that it's the story of Cain killing his brother Abel. But actually, that's not true. The first place we see bloodshed is where God brings animal skins to Adam and Eve to cover themselves after they've sinned and become aware of their own nakedness. They tried to cover themselves with fig leaves, but we all know how long and how long fig leaves last, and how insufficient of a covering leaves would be if that's all you had to cover yourself with. So the idea in our heads is this: sin has now entered the world and something has to die. Something has died. God's the one who brings the animal skins to Adam and Eve to begin with. But before that, there was no bloodshed on the earth, and there were no carnivores. Adam and Eve were not eating meat. They were eating fruits, seed-bearing fruits, it says. Well, now God says to Noah and his sons, "As I then gave you every green plant, I now give you everything to eat." In other words, as these animals start repopulating, you're allowed to eat meat. Please do eat meat. You're going to need to eat meat to sustain you in this earth that has drastically transformed from what it was when I first created it. A lot of people don't realize that there are a lot of years. If you follow the biblical timeline, there are a lot of years between Adam and the flood. Almost 2,000 years. Most estimates are like 16 to 1,700 years between Adam and the flood. And when you consider how long people were living then and the potential rates of reproduction for all these Early people who were not corrupt, like their bodies hadn't learned how to deteriorate yet. That's why they lived so long. There's a possibility that there were as many people on the earth when the flood came as there are on the earth today. There were a lot of people, and there had been already almost 2,000 years of human history. If you follow the biblical timeline from Adam to Noah, everything happened so fast in Genesis as we read that we sometimes fail to take these things into account. Okay. The third thing that's entailed in this covenant between God and Noah, who's representing all of humanity at this point, is this. The allotment of the animals for food comes with a new kind of dominion for humans over the animals. God tells Noah and his sons that the creatures will fear them. This is what it says. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. Wait a minute. Am I reading the wrong verse? Here you go. It's actually the verse before. This is Genesis 9:2. Forgive me. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. So this is a different kind of dominion that God is giving to Noah over the animals than he gave to Adam, whose relationship with creation and with the animals was completely different than Noah's. God says that the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth. If you go out in the wild today, still most wild animals avoid humans. Most animals, if they encounter a human, take off and run or are scared. And believe it or not, even animals who are large predators, apex predators, who you might not think are afraid of humans, would rather avoid humans altogether and are afraid of humans when they encounter them, which is why sometimes they act so fierce and defiant, because they're actually scared. So this is true. God put the fear of humans on the animals after the flood. And then and probably the reason for that is because God's now giving the animal kingdom to humans as sustenance to sustain them. There's one other part of this. This is the fourth part of this covenant between God and Noah. God says, and for your lifeblood, I will require a reckoning. From every beast, I will require it, and from man. From his fellow man, I will require a reckoning for the life of man. And right before that, when God says, I give you the animals to eat, he says in verse 4, but you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. So God sets apart blood as the one part of an animal that humans are not supposed to eat. And he says that blood represents the life of the animal. This is why many Christians and Jews to this day do not take part, and I don't believe should take part, in blood rituals that many other cultures around the world have as part of their customs. I spent time in a country once that has a blood ritual. I think it's every other year. I didn't take part in it, and I wasn't there for it, but I learned about it while I was there. In Nepal, they have a ritual where people drink yak blood during this one point on the Hindu calendar every other year. There was a time I remember my wife and I were watching this documentary about people getting through Africa, traveling through Tanzania and encountering these different tribes. And at one point, this group of Westerners took part in this blood ritual with an African tribe where they cut a goat's neck and took some blood out. The goat lived. They just made enough of an incision to let blood drain out, and then they drank it. I remember my wife and I ended up having a conversation about that. It's like, there's something wrong with this, right? It's like, yeah, there's a stipulation really early on after the flood that we're not supposed to drink blood or eat blood from animals because that represents their life. That's sort of a sacred thing to God. The blood of a living creature represents their life. And this will come full circle when we get into the new covenant that Jesus Christ initiated at his Last Supper, where he tells us that every time we drink, we are to remember that we are drinking his blood, which represents more than just physical sustenance. It represents new life for us. And he shed it to give us new life. This is where we draw the line. This is the difference between all the death that's ever taken place in the history of the world and the one death that made atonement for your sins and mine. So these are some of the things that are a part of this deal that God makes with Noah. Hey, on your end, be fruitful and multiply. You're now entitled to eat meat. I've given the animals into your hand. I've put the fear of you upon them. Don't drink blood or eat blood. And also, anyone who spills human blood, human or animal, I will require a reckoning for that. This is really the first time in the Bible, or I should say after the flood, really. This is like an early pre-law example of God saying, I don't want any killing going on the earth of human beings. Man should not spill the blood of his fellow man. That's what it means when God says, I will require a reckoning for the blood of a man. This is really the only time in the Bible also that I can think of where God actually seems to imply that even animals will be held responsible for things that they do that go against God's design. God says, even the creatures, of them I will require a reckoning for the spilling of human blood. This is from Genesis chapter 9, verse 5. And for your lifeblood, I will require a reckoning. From every beast, I will require it, and from man. Have you ever thought about that? There's this passage in Genesis 9 where God seems to be implying that there's something that an animal can do wherein God will require a reckoning from them, almost like there's this moral choice that they have to make, almost like the animals somehow are given this instinct that even though, animals kill other animals to survive, killing man is like crossing the line. I don't know. It's an interesting thought. The Bible doesn't really say any much more about that, but it's something that I've thought of often, and I find it interesting. I thought I'd point it out. So let's just continue, read the second part of this passage when it comes to the Noahic Covenant, and then we'll get on to the Abrahamic Covenant and see what that entails. Genesis 9, verses 7 through 11 go like this. God says again, and you be fruitful and multiply, increase greatly on the earth, and multiply in it. Then God said to Noah and his sons, behold, I will establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and every beast of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. It is for every beast of the earth. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. So this is the last part of the covenant. And it basically says that on God's part, he will never flood the earth again with water. He will never destroy humanity via a flood. And he offered a sign as a promise of this, and that sign is the rainbow. Remember, in the story of the great flood in Genesis chapter 6 through 9, God destroys humanity because of their wickedness, because of their evil, because the thoughts of their heart have become only evil continually. There's not one person on the earth who even does a righteous deed besides Noah and his family. And it's sad. It's really sad that the sign that God will always show mercy and never destroy humanity in that way again because of our wickedness is the rainbow. When it rains and we see a rainbow, we're supposed to take comfort in the fact that God's mercy is upon us. Somehow in our culture, that sign that God gave us has been co-opted by a specific group of people as a way of wagging their finger at God as they celebrate and take pleasure in and glory in their sin. And that's a sad thing. And I'm not calling for anything other than we should pray for these people, and we should have mercy on them, share the truth with them, love them. But let's not downplay the significance of that symbol, the rainbow, as now it's the sign of gay pride and trans pride and all this stuff. That's just so wicked. It is such a mockery to God. It's literally like wagging your finger in God's face. And we should have pity on people who have enough pride to do that. I must say one other thing. God says he will never destroy the earth again via the flood. But that's not to say that this earth will not pass away, because God tells us that this earth will pass away, and it will pass away as he's ushering in the new earth that comes down out of heaven. So 2 Peter 3:10 says, but the day of the Lord will come like a thief. The heavens will disappear with a roar. The elements will be destroyed by fire, and the earth and everything done in it will be laid bare. Gives us the impression that this earth will be consumed by fire, and if you keep reading and put more passages together, as the new heavens and the new earth are descending down for all of God's new creation to inhabit them. So this is the Noahic Covenant, my friends. This is what it entailed. There's a lot more to it than people think. There were things and are things in that covenant that God promised to do and promised not to do. And there's parts of that covenant that Noah and who he represents, which is humanity and all created beings, have to uphold. For humans' part, there's the be fruitful and multiply. And look, I'm not saying that every single one of these applies to every single person, but we're talking about, generally speaking, God's telling humanity, be fruitful and multiply. Don't stop being fruitful and multiplying in the earth. Don't eat and drink blood. Blood represents the life of an animal, and that one part of an animal is set apart. I don't want you taking part in that. As I gave you every green plant, so now I give you everything to eat. Meat is now an acceptable thing to be eaten by humans. And on God's part, he promises, I'm never going to flood the earth again in this way to destroy humanity. And I will keep you and protect you. It's really fascinating when you dive into the depth of some of the depth of these covenants, how much more there is to these than meets the eye. Another part of it, the fear and the dread of you shall be upon every beast, and I will require a reckoning for anyone who takes the blood of man. And that's an expression for taking the life of someone, in my opinion. So that's interesting. That's the first covenant that we come to in the Bible. Some folks say that there's a covenant before that God makes with Adam. That's sort of not agreed upon, and it's definitely not as explicit as this one. Like I told you, the first place that the word covenant is used in the Bible is Genesis 6, which is where the story of Noah begins. So I'm going to take about a 55-second break. I'm going to play this video for you quickly, and I will be back in less than 60 seconds to talk about the Abrahamic Covenant, which is our last topic of the day. I'll be right back. Hey, if you're enjoying this content, I want to encourage you to visit our website, 𝗏𝑦𝑜�may_know_him.com. There you will find all of our past videos, all of our past podcast episodes, and our podcast series cataloged and categorized, as well as our blog, Coffee with God, where you'll find Bible studies, devotions, and biblical and theological articles, all for free. We don't charge for anything whatsoever on our website. I started this ministry back in 2021, and if you feel led to do so, we would love your support. Every little bit helps. $20 a month, $10 a month, even $5 a month goes a long way to helping us accomplish our mission of illuminating biblical truth, applying it to faith, life, and culture, so that you can know and love and walk with Jesus like never before. Couple of quick things I want to just touch on from the chat. One comment says, so we shouldn't eat steak rare because of the blood. That's actually a really interesting observation that I've never thought much about. It's my understanding when it talks about not partaking in blood in Genesis chapter 9, that we're talking about blood specifically. You shall not eat the flesh with its life, that is its blood. There's people that really take, I mean, they go all in with the blood. They actually drink the blood, eat the blood, dip their organs in blood. I've never thought of it as being applied to rare meat, where you cook a steak really rare and there might be like a little drip or a vein of diluted blood on the plate. I like my steaks medium rare, probably even more on the rare side than the medium well side, but medium rare. But that's interesting. It's something I've never really thought about. Does having a steak rare or a piece of meat rare where you're getting some blood constitute that? I don't know. It's something to think about. And then also, what Jesus said in the Last Supper was, every time you eat this bread and drink this cup. So he's talking about, in that instance, the communion cup and the communion bread. I personally, when I'm with my family, we often pray when we bless the food that God would allow us to remember the broken body and shed blood of the Lord as we eat. I don't really think that constitutes taking communion, although some might say it does. I don't know. That's just something that we've done for a long time. I'm not even sure where I picked that up exactly. I just know that when I eat and drink, I try to remember that the Lord is my true sustenance. He is the bread of life. He is the true vine. When Jesus stood up in Jerusalem during one of the Passover feasts, before the last one, the one that he was killed during, he said, if you don't eat my flesh and drink my blood, you're not worthy of me, something like that. He stood up and talked about eating his flesh and drinking his blood. And it really freaked people out. And that's the moment when he lost a lot of his following, because people just did not get what he was talking about. Okay, let's now move on to the Abrahamic Covenant. And this is one of the two that people know the most about. Typically, it's the most talked about, definitely. It's the most layered. If you thought the Noahic Covenant was more layered than you thought, this one's definitely more layered than you might think. God's promises to Abraham take place over several different occurrences. God first appears to Abraham and makes promises to him in Genesis chapter 12, but then he keeps on appearing and making more promises. And it almost seems like, as Abraham is being faithful to God's commands and looking forward to God's promises, God keeps getting more detailed, more specific, and also more expansive about what he's going to do for Abraham. So like the Noahic Covenant, this thing goes both ways, right? God gave humanity something to do in the Noahic Covenant, and God promised to uphold his part. And when it comes to Abraham's covenant, this gets much more intense. There are very specific things that God calls Abraham to do, and there are very specific promises that God makes on his part. But it doesn't just all happen at once, even though many people, when they talk about it, they make it seem like it all just happens at once. And we tend to mix all these different promises and encounters that God and Abraham have over quite a long period of time together. But what you're going to see, I think, is that no. God gives something Abraham to do. God gives something to Abraham to do, accompanied with a promise. And then when Abraham does it, God comes back and says, good, now let's go to the next phase. Good, now let's go to the next phase. And this whole thing picks up momentum as Abraham proves time and time again that he is a man of faith who believes God and also obeys God. Remember, Abraham, the story of Abraham's life is used in the New Testament by two different biblical writers, and it's actually used in exact opposite ways. Paul uses the story of Abraham's life to say, look, Abraham believed God before he was even able to act in obedience to God. Therefore, his faith made him righteous. James comes along and says, hey, Abraham did the thing that God asked him to do, which proved that his faith was genuine. Therefore, it wasn't just faith, it was his action that proved that he was righteous. And which one of those is true? They're both true. They're two sides of the same coin. Christians for hundreds of years have been picking and choosing and saying, I'm on this side, I'm on that side, it's this, it's that. No. We're not supposed to put that in a nice, tidy little theological box and pick one over the other. We're supposed to say, okay, both are true. Now let's live in the tension and let's be people who are faithful to God in our trust, in our hope, in our expectation, and also in our actions and in our deeds. Let's not just be Christians in word only. Let's be Christians in what we do. It's the church father Ignatius of Antioch. I drop this quote all the time because it's one of my favorites. He says, I don't want to be called a Christian. I want to actually be one. It's not enough to be called a Christian. I want to be a Christian. And when I am a Christian, then I'll be worthy of the name. Okay. So God's promises to Abraham, in my opinion, are, I hate to use the word progressive because there's this whole strain of progressive revelation and progressive theology that I don't really want to tap into right now. But let's just say God's promises to Abraham grow and increase as Abraham is faithful to God. So let's set the stage here when it comes to the story of God and Abraham and God. God's first appearance to Abraham is very likely within a period of time when the flood generation and those who immediately followed it were still alive on the earth. Did you know that? And this is based on how long people lived back then and the biblical chronologies that are laid out for us in the Old Testament. The Bible says that Shem lived 502 years after the flood, for a total of 602 years. Those were the years of Shem's life. Shem was the righteous son of Noah, who is generally considered to be the one who came from the good line of Noah's descendants. Abraham was born 352 years after the flood, if you follow the biblical chronology. And by the way, it's during these first several centuries after the flood that you see lifespans decrease significantly from generation to generation. Nobody knows exactly why. God does put a limit on the lifespan of people before the flood, but some people speculate maybe it's because the atmosphere has drastically changed. You know, the situation on earth is a lot different. Things aren't as they were before. It's not as ideal of a situation. That could be the way in which God caused the lifespan of humanity to decrease. I don't know, but we just know that lifespans are decreasing at a rapid rate in the centuries that immediately follow the flood. And we also know that Shem was alive when Abraham was born and lived another 150 years. It's very possible that people on the earth who were learning about the one true God and who did have a knowledge of God, despite the fact that paganism had, by the time Abraham's born, already spread all over the world because of the scattering of the people after the Tower of Babel. It's possible that Shem was the righteous man on earth who knew the history, who knew the story, who lived through the flood, who knew Yahweh, who was telling people about him. And Abraham, or Abraham's father, might have been one of those people who understood, who believed, who knew the truth about Yahweh. You know, there are some scholars who believe that Melchizedek, who we meet later on in Abraham's story, this man who is apparently without lineage, without father or mother, but who is a priest unto God, whose name means King of Righteousness, maybe that individual was actually Shem, but that's pure speculation. I told you there was going to be a lot of Bible history in this episode. Okay, in the first instance of God appearing to Abraham, we see the Lord stepping into history to try and create a new line of people who would walk in faithfulness. Remember, before the flood, God only had one family who walked uprightly. After the flood, members of that family became corrupted, and it wasn't long before humanity's once again multiplying, spreading, growing rapidly, and we have this story that takes place about the Tower of Babel, where man has devised an idea to build a tower to heaven to try and literally go and usurp God and overthrow him and usurp God's authority. You can see how God might be saying to himself, boy, this is going the exact same way it went before. But he has a plan, and his plan is to set apart one man to create one righteous line, one righteous family and nation through which he will usher in the Messiah. So Abraham's father, Terah, was a worshiper of idols. We know that pretty well from extra biblical history, but God still plucked him out of Ur the Chaldees and told him to go to a land that God would show him. He started the journey, but then stopped. And when he died, God picked up the endeavor with his son, who at this point in time is called Abram. And this is where we get to part one of God's encounters with Abram. By the way, the name Abram means exalted father. We'll get to what the name Abraham means when we get to that part of the story. So God's first promise to Abram is to bless those who bless him and to make a nation of him. For Abram's part, he must go to the land that God would show him. Let's read Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now it must be said that we're told early on in the story of Abram that his wife is unable to bear children. So it makes you wonder, did God wait for someone after this after the flood and this post-flood generation is alive on the earth? Did God wait for someone who was unable to have kids to begin his redemptive work? I think it's possible. And I think it's supported by the fact that not only did God select a husband and wife who were unable to have kids, he also waited until they were far past their childbearing years. Sarah was 90 when Isaac was born. Abraham was 100. By doing it this way, God was able to demonstrate that the fulfillment of his promises to Abraham were supernatural. In this first part of the promise, and I want to point out, the passage I just read to you, Genesis 12, 1 through 3, there is no mention of a covenant in this passage. There are promises that God makes to Abram. That's it. There's no mention of covenant. That comes later. In this first part, Abram is promised four things. I will make of you a great nation, God says. I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And finally, number 4, in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Those are the 4 things that God promises to Abram. At this point in the story, after Abram's first encounter with God, that's all we have. If you knew nothing of biblical history or the biblical narrative and you stopped reading here, it would be pretty hazy in terms of how this is going to turn out. Keep in mind, there is also, not only is there not a mention of covenant in this first encounter between God and Abram, there's no promise of him inheriting and keeping the land, or of his offspring inheriting and keeping the land. First, Abram must obey God. And what God told him to do was to go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. My friends, as I've said on other live streams recently, this was not a small task. This was not safe. This was not easy. It required faith. It required trust. It required hard work. Picking up your possessions, leaving what is essentially Babylon in ancient times before the word Babylon existed, and setting out caravan style in a world where there were probably very few trails, walking through desert terrain to go to a place that God says, I'll show you when you're there. And by the way, when you get there, it's going to be full of Canaanites, Amorites, Amalekites, Girgashites, all these groups of people who are pagan, violent, and warring with each other. Interesting, right? Now, let's keep going. In Genesis 12, verses 5 through 7, this is what happens. Again, there's time that's passing here, but the way the story goes, it almost seems like we're just going from one event to the next. You know, God tells Abram, get up and go. The next day, he got up and went and came to the land. You know, he got on the bullet train from Ur of the Chaldees, from Haran, and took it to Canaan, and he was there. No, that's not how it worked. This is months, if not years later. It says, when they came to the land of Canaan, Abraham obeyed. Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. So they passed through a land full of tribes, hostile and dangerous. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring, I will give this land. There it is. The first time God promises to Abram, I'm going to give your offspring this land. So we just added a fifth element to God's promises to Abram. Make of you a great nation, bless you and make your name great, bless those who bless you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now, Abram, to your offspring, I will give this land. God, you just told me to come here, and now I'm here. Aren't you giving me the land? No, it's for your offspring. You're going to live here as a sojourner for much of your life, but one day your offspring will inherit it. Really makes you see how important children, offspring, families, legacy were to these people back then. Hugely important. Abram would have gladly suffered and sojourned his whole life in a land not his if he knew the promise of God. I'm going to give this to your offspring and to your children's children was going to come to pass. That's like absolutely no problem. If my offspring are going to be great, I'm a happy camper. So at this point, God expands the promise. Why? Because Abram obeyed. He got up and he went to the land. Now, part 2 of God's encounters with Abram and his covenant with Abram. This is where we're going to see the word covenant pop up, is from Genesis chapter 15. This is the story where God passes through cut up pieces of animal as a sign of the covenant he has made with Abram. And he says again, to your offspring, I give this land. However, God says, first, they will be taken into bondage, your offspring. And they, like you, will be sojourners in a foreign land. But they will eventually come out with great possessions, God says, after the 4th generation, and they will inherit this land. God also promises that Abram's offspring would be as the stars of heaven, and that Abram would go to his fathers in peace and be buried in a good old age. Meaning, Abram, you're not going to die violently. You're not going to die because of bloodshed. You're not going to die because of disease. You're going to go to your fathers in peace. Meaning, I'm going to close your eyes peacefully when you're a very old man in a good old age. That's a pretty wonderful promise from God, in my opinion. And it's tough to apply that to all of Abram's offspring, even though many of these promises, people say, apply to all of Abram's offspring today. So Abram's offspring did come out after the fourth generation, as God said, but that generation did not inherit the land. Who knows what I'm talking about? Here, God says, your offspring, I will set them free from captivity after the fourth generation, and they will inherit the land. They came out after the fourth generation, but if you recall, and we'll get into this next week, the generation that was known as the wilderness generation, the Israelites that God freed from Egypt, did not obey the Lord. And so that generation was not allowed to inherit the land. It was the next generation, the fifth generation, that ended up inheriting the land. And believe it or not, that example, that story, is used 3 different times in the New Testament by 3 different New Testament writers as a way of warning Christians not to be people who come to faith in Jesus, but then eventually back away and fall back into unbelief, but to be people who continue in faith, lay hold of the promises, and inherit them, to quote the author of Hebrews. Can you think of the other 2 New Testament writers who used the wilderness generation as an example to Christians, as sort of a way of warning Christians not to be slack and lazy with the promises of God? It's really, really interesting. Okay, let's keep going and read the rest of Genesis 15, and then we'll go on from there. So Genesis 15, 4 through 18, I'm not going to read all of this because there's way too much. I'll read a little bit, and then I'll summarize for you. I don't like to be limited by time, but we're already almost an hour in, and I want to try to wrap this up as soon as I can without not being thorough. But let me just start in Genesis 15, 4. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. Well, let me set this up for you. So God appears to Abram again a second time, and Abram basically says, Lord, I trust you, I believe you, but I don't have a son. I still don't have a son. You promised me you would give me offspring, and I only have this member of my household who's my servant, who's basically my heir. And God says, no. This man will not be your heir. I promised you children, and I'm going to do it. That's where this really takes off. So let me start again. Genesis 15, starting in verse 4. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. This man shall not be your heir, Abram. Your very own son shall be your heir. And he, the Lord, brought Abram outside and said, look toward heaven and number the stars, if you're able to number them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. And Abram believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land to possess. But he said, Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? He said to him, bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And this is the point in the story where God tells Abram to cut the animals in half and set them on opposing sides. This was one of the ways that scholars believe covenants were made in ancient days. You cut an animal in half, you separate the 2 pieces, and then both parties walk through the animals, walk in between them as a way of saying, if I break my covenant, may what happened to these animals happen to me. I promise I will hold up my end of the covenant, my end of the friendship marked by faithfulness and by obedience to what I said I was going to do. But in this case, God causes a deep sleep to fall on Abram, and God passes through on his own. And that's signified by the smoldering fire pot that goes through. Let me just read you that part. It says, as the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land not theirs, and will be servants there. They will be afflicted for 400 years, but I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. Why is there darkness falling on Abram? It's a question people often ask. It's that God's showing him what's going to happen to the future generations. There's going to be tough times. There's going to be bondage and affliction, but I will bring them out of that, and I will bring them into this land with great possessions. When the sun had gone down, verse 17, and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring, I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, etc., etc. And everything that God says in this passage came to pass. He promises to make of Abraham a great nation. He promises to give him an heir, and he promises to give his offspring the land. Not one promise of these did not come to pass as the story unfolds. We have to keep reading the story to see how it unfolds. We can't go back into an ancient covenant, pluck part of it out, and say, see, this is a promise that God made to so-and-so back then, and I think that it still applies to us today, or I think that it still applies to them today. Well, did you read the rest of the story? Did you see what happened after that? Because I'll tell you, in the book of Joshua, chapter 21, it says that not one promise that the Lord had made to the house of Israel failed. Every single one of the promises God made to Israel came to pass. It's Joshua 21, 43 to 45. Thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that he swore to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it, and they settled there. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their fathers. Not one of all their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all their enemies into their hand. Not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. I'm pretty sure I quoted that correctly. Joshua 21, 43 to 45. But go read it and double check, because that was from memory, and I hope I didn't mess it up. So this is part 2 of God's dealings with Abram. And now we're going to get to part 3, where God makes a covenant with Abram and his offspring. And he once again promises to give them the land, but there's a new stipulation added onto it. There's a new element. There's a new part of this. For their part, they must continue to circumcise every male child amongst them. This was a way of setting them apart from the nations around them. It says that any uncircumcised male child would be cut off from the people. Keep in mind that Abram, at this point in time, still does not have a son by his wife, Sarai. At this point, her name's Sarai. Her name will soon be Sarah, and Abram's name is about to be changed to Abraham. It's about to be changed from exalted father, Abram, to Abraham, which means father of a multitude or father of nations. But this is what happens. God appears to him for a third time. Abraham's 99 years old. God says, I'm going to give you a son. And Abram says, what about Ishmael? Oh, that Ishmael might live before you. God says, no. Just like he said before, Eliezer of Damascus is not going to be your heir. Neither is Ishmael going to be your heir. Because God values the covenant of marriage so much that Abram cannot have an heir that God sees fit without Sarah being involved. It had to be both of them. It wasn't enough for Abram to have a son with his concubine, with his wife's servant, who she gave to him as a wife. No, it had to be Sarah. It had to be through Sarah. So this is how it goes. Genesis 17, starting in verse 1. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, so that I may make my covenant between me and you, and so that you may multiply greatly. Then Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, exalted father, but your name shall be called Abraham, father of a multitude. For I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. Do you see how this covenant, these promises that God's making to Abraham are just expanding and growing and getting greater and greater as Abraham continues to walk in obedience to God? And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and them the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. Now it must be said here that in order to see this come to pass and to actually read about this account taking place, you have to stick around for the next part, which is the Mosaic Covenant. I know I already said that, but I'm just repeating it because we can't read these things in a vacuum. You got to keep going with the story. Let's keep going. God said to Abram, as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between us. He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised. Every male throughout your generations, whether born in your house, bought with your money from a foreigner, even if they're not your offspring, both he who's in your house and he who's bought shall surely be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. Pretty intense words. Any male who is not circumcised shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. Look, there's a lot of times talk about circumcision is misunderstood, and it's not really done in a thorough way. This custom is this custom is actually prevalent around the world now. I don't know what the stats are on male circumcision, religious and non-religious, but in the Middle East, whether you're talking about Jewish people, Muslim people, Christian people, this custom is almost universal. As far as I know, the majority of men in the West still keep this custom, not for religious reasons. It's just become something that's ingrained in humanity, quote unquote, like loosely. Circumcision is a thing. But this was a sign of the covenant between God and Abram and Abram's offspring. They were to be circumcised in their flesh. It was a mark in their flesh that signified that they were set apart from the world, that they were keeping God's covenant. And God says it very simply. If there's a male that's uncircumcised, he has broken my covenant and he's cut off. That right there sort of answers the question that we started this episode with. When people make these vague terms about covenants, well, they're unconditional, well, they're unbreakable. That's not true. That's not true. God never breaks his covenants, but when they're broken, they're broken. That's the way it goes. A covenant is an everlasting promise until it's broken. And once that happens, it no longer stands. Now, some Christians say this is I think a foolish thing to say, but people still say it. If God's covenants if God's covenants to Israel can be broken, how can we be sure that his covenants to us still stand? Well, here's what you got to realize. God never broke his covenant with Israel. He fulfilled it. That's what the New Testament says. Jesus said, not one jot or tittle will pass from the law until all is accomplished or fulfilled. Jesus said, I did not come to take down the law. I came to fulfill it. And fulfill it he did. That's why you always have to keep reading the story. You can't pluck things out of the story and take them isolated and try to build doctrines out of them. Keep reading the story. The old covenant was fulfilled by the offspring of Abram, Christ, in order that he might establish a new covenant. And the new covenant actually covers for the weakness and the sinfulness of humanity, because we're no longer breaking the covenant every time we make a mistake, fall into sin, break one of God's laws. We are kept in covenant with God through faith. Through faith. You hold on to faith. You keep believing, trusting God. He's your Lord. Jesus is your Savior. You believe him. You believe his promises. You believe Jesus got up from the dead. You are a person of faith. You're a part of the covenant, the new covenant. And Paul goes as far as to say that it is the people of faith who are the true sons and daughters of Abraham. But just to wrap up on this point of circumcision, it must be pointed out, the issue of circumcision being a continual part of God's covenant with Abraham, is not something that's pointed out or pointed to by Christians today who want to make the case that God's old covenant with Israel is still somehow relevant or valid, or people who want to say that we Christians are called to keep the law. I mean, I know Christians who have gone so far as to say Christians have to keep the law. We keep the law. It's, they quote the first part of Jesus's statement from Matthew 5:17. Thank you, Christine, for putting that in the chat. Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. They'll quote the first part of that, but forget the second part. Just leave that part out. The reason that people don't use circumcision as a point of contention is because the New Testament uses it over and over and over again as a way of saying, this profits nothing, spiritually speaking. Being circumcised no longer is required. In fact, if you think that coming to God through outward works is going to get you somewhere, you're missing the whole point of the gospel and the new covenant. The new covenant covers your human frailty. You still have to have faith, and genuine faith urges you to try your best to live a righteous life. Hopefully you learn to live a righteous life in the power of the Spirit. But the point is, works do not save you. And it's very clear in the New Testament, very clear, that circumcision is no longer a part of any covenant that God has with humanity, even though it says right here that any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin will be cut off from the people of God. He has broken my covenant, God said to Abraham. But like I've said many times on this episode, you have to keep reading because the story goes on and the new covenant comes out in all of its glory when you keep reading. And you always have to read as a Christian. Look, this is a debate that's going on in the church like crazy right now in scholarly circles. I tell this to students in my biblical interpretation class all the time. I say this a lot on the show. There's a whole debate in the world of Christian scholarship and theology and Messianic Jewish studies, Jewish apologists, dispensationalists versus, covenant theologians. Do we read the Old Testament on its own terms, or do we read it in light of the New Testament? My friends, we read the Old Testament in light of the New Testament. Yes, we read it on its own terms to understand the story, but always at the end of the day, as Christians, we see the Old Testament through the lens of the New Testament. Christ is the key. You got to keep reading. You can't stop partway through the story. Okay, my friends. So even still in this passage, God says this sign is an everlasting covenant, an everlasting sign, a sign of the everlasting covenant. But we know from the finished work of Christ and from the New Testament that even this sign of circumcision is no longer something that's required for the people of faith. So it's an hour and 15 minutes in. We have gone pretty thoroughly, I believe, through the first two covenants that God made with humanity. Look, there's more to the story of God's relationship with Abraham. It continues to evolve. Abraham's moment of radical obedience, his greatest moment of radical obedience, hasn't even come yet. That comes a few chapters later when God tells him to go sacrifice Isaac on an altar. He goes to do it, and God stops him and says, no, no, no. I, the Lord, will provide the sacrifice, as a way of foreshadowing his offering up of his own son. God says in that moment, now I know, Abraham, that you fear me and that you will always obey me. So it gets even better than this, but I think I've given you these first three encounters between God and Abraham are really, really important. And they each have to be taken one at a time if you're going to see that this relationship and these promises progress as Abraham walks in obedience. We can't just sort of generically, vaguely quote random things that God says to Abraham and say, oh, this is the covenant. The covenant that God makes with Abraham is multifaceted, and it's not found in one passage or another. It's found throughout the story. It's scattered throughout the story of God and Abraham. So it's been a lot of fun. I encourage you to read the entire story of Noah. It would be good to start in Genesis 6 and read all the way through Genesis 9 to really get a grasp of that covenant that God made with all of humanity, Noah representing all of humanity and all living creatures. And also, I suggest you read the story of Abraham, which starts in Genesis 12 and goes all the way through up to the Genesis mid-20s. And then it passes off onto Isaac and Jacob and his sons and grandsons. But this has been a lot of fun, and I'll be back next week to go over the next two Old Testament covenants, which are the Mosaic Covenant, that's a big one, and the Davidic Covenant, both of which foreshadow Christ and the New Covenant. And then 2 weeks from now, we'll dive into the New Covenant, and we'll just see it in all its glory. Also, I want to remind you, I'll be back on Friday for our first Q&A of the month, our first live Q&A of the month. First two questions I'm answering this week have to do with the authorship of the letters of Peter and the Gospel of Mark. I have a question about that. So I'll talk about the history of those letters, that letter and that gospel, those letters, 1st and 2nd Peter, and that gospel, the Gospel of Mark. I also have a question about what the water represents in 1 John chapter 5, verses 6 through 8. It's that verse that talks about there are three that testify, the Spirit and the water and the blood, and these three agree. So that's a fun question. I'm excited to answer that. If I have time, I'll answer another one of the questions that have been submitted to us recently. I've already got a backlog, but if you've sent us questions, I will get to them over the next several Friday Q&As. If you want to show up for that episode and ask a question live, please feel free to do so. We always save time at the end to answer live questions. So that's all I got for you today. I'm Blake Barbera. This has been That You May Know Him, illuminating biblical truth and applying it to faith, life, and culture. Until next time, stay blessed, live loved, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for watching. My name's Blake, and over the past 20 years, I've been a missionary, a pastor, and a Bible college and seminary professor. During that entire time, I've been teaching the Bible. And if you want more Bible content to come your way, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and like this video. And also, check out this video right here.